Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The pounding started around 9:30 that Saturday night in October 2018, right when I was getting ready to watch a movie alone in my apartment. I was 28 then, had just moved to Denver 6 months earlier for a marketing job, and was living in this old brick building from the 60s with paper-thin walls and creaky floors. My place was on the 3rd floor, Unit 3B, sandwiched between two other apartments that usually stayed pretty quiet, except for the occasional TV noise or footsteps. I remember I just made myself some popcorn and was settling into my couch when the banging erupted from 3C next door. Not knocking, but desperate, rhythmic pounding that made my entire wall vibrate. Between the impacts, I could hear a man's voice, muffled but urgent, saying my name over and over. "Jessica, Jessica, please come quick." I knew the voice belonged to my neighbor Grant, this guy in his 40s who'd lived there for years and mostly kept to himself, except for the polite nods we'd exchange in the hallway. The pounding got more intense, and then I heard him clearly through the wall. "Jessica, someone's hurt bad. Please, I need help. Open your door." My first instinct was to grab my phone and call 911, but something about the raw panic in his voice made me jump up and rush to my door. I pressed my ear against it, trying to hear better, and Grant's voice came again, closer now, like he was right outside in the hallway. "Jessica, please, she's bleeding. I don't know what to do. Just come to my door, hurry." I grabbed my keys and phone, my heart hammering against my ribs, and slowly turned the deadbolt. The hallway was dimmer than usual. One of the overhead bulbs had burned out earlier that week, and the landlord hadn't fixed it yet, leaving these long shadows stretching across the worn burgundy carpet. Grant's door was maybe 15 feet from mine, and I could see it was cracked open about 6 inches, just darkness visible through the gap. "Grant," I called out, taking a step into the hallway, and his voice came immediately from inside his apartment. "In here, quick, please." But something made me pause right there in my doorway. Maybe it was how his voice sounded exactly the same as before, like a recording being played back with that same inflection on the word, "please." I gripped my phone tighter, already pulling up the dial pad for 911, when I noticed something that made every muscle in my body tense up. There were no sounds coming from inside his apartment except his voice, no crying, no movement, nothing that suggested someone injured. That's when I caught movement in my peripheral vision, down at the far end of the hallway near the stairwell, and I turned my head just enough to see Mr. Brennan from 3A, the unit on the other side of mine, standing there in the shadows. He was this skinny older man, maybe 60-something, with these thick glasses and a habit of wearing the same gray cardigan every day, and he was just standing there, not moving toward his door or the stairs, just watching me. The strange thing was, he had his hands behind his back and was rocking slightly on his heels, like he was waiting for something, and when our eyes met, he gave me this little nod and started walking toward me, not rushing, just taking these measured, deliberate steps down the hallway. "Everything all right, Jessica?" he asked in this soft, almost sing-song voice that I'd never heard him use before in the 2 years we'd been neighbors. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get back inside my apartment, but I was caught between Grant's door still calling my name. "Jessica, she's dying, please," and Mr. Brennan closing the distance between us with those steady, purposeful steps. I pressed 911 on my phone but kept it at my side, not raising it to my ear yet, trying to look calm while my mind raced through what was happening. "Grant needs help," I said to Mr. Brennan, taking a small step backward toward my door, testing his reaction. "Someone's hurt in there." His face did this weird thing where he smiled but only with his mouth, his eyes staying completely flat behind those thick lenses, and he said, "Oh yes, I heard all that noise too. Terrible thing. Why don't you go help him? I'll make sure nobody disturbs you." The way he emphasized "nobody disturbs you" made my throat go dry, and I noticed his hands were still hidden behind his back, his knuckles making small movements like he was gripping something. Grant's voice came again from his apartment, louder this time, more desperate. "Jessica, I can't stop the bleeding, please." But here's what really made me realize I was in danger. His voice was coming from the exact same spot as before, hadn't moved an inch within the apartment, and when I glanced at his cracked door, I could see through the gap that his living room light was off, but there was this faint blue glow, like from a phone screen held low. Mr. Brennan was now only about 10 feet away, still approaching with that empty smile, and he tilted his head slightly and said, "Grant really does need you in there, Jessica. He's been talking about you for weeks, you know. Says you're perfect." My thumb found the call button on my phone, and I started backing up faster toward my door. But then Grant's door suddenly swung open wider, and I saw a hand grip the doorframe from inside. Not Grant's hand, because Grant has these small, soft hands I'd noticed when he'd helped me carry groceries once. But this hand was huge, with thick fingers and dirt under the nails, wearing what looked like a latex glove. I hit the call button and spun around, launching myself toward my apartment door. But Mr. Brennan moved faster than I expected for his age, lunging forward and grabbing my wrist with surprising strength. Now, Jessica, that's very rude when your neighbor needs help," he hissed, his breath smelling like cigarettes and something medicinal, and I could feel his other hand coming around from behind his back. I yanked my arm hard and screamed, not a scared whimper, but a full-throated primal scream that echoed down the hallway, while the 911 operator's voice came tiny and distant from my phone. 911, what's your emergency?" Mr. Brennan's grip loosened for just a second, probably not expecting me to be so loud, and I jerked free, stumbling toward my door while screaming the address into the phone. Behind me, I heard heavy footsteps emerging from Grant's apartment, multiple sets of feet, and Grant's real voice, not the recorded one, saying something angry and frustrated that I couldn't make out. I crashed into my door, scrambling with the keys while looking back to see 3 figures now in the hallway. Mr. Brennan, a massive man I'd never seen before wearing work coveralls and those latex gloves, and Grant himself, who looked nothing like the nervous, fidgety neighbor I knew. His face was calm, focused, and he was holding what looked like a roll of duct tape in one hand and zip ties in the other. The 911 operator was asking questions, but I just kept screaming my address and 3 men trying to break in over and over while jamming my key into the lock. The big man in coveralls started moving toward me, not running but walking with this terrible confidence like he knew he could catch me, and Mr. Brennan was saying something to Grant about the other doors, which made me realize they might have keys. They might have been planning this for who knows how long, studying my schedule, waiting for a Saturday night when the building was quietest. My key finally turned and I threw myself inside, slamming the door and turning the deadbolt, just as bodies crashed against it from the other side. The door shook in its frame, and I heard Mr. Brennan's voice, calm and instructional. "Grant, you said the landlord gave you the master key last month." My entire body went cold as I heard metal scraping against the lock, and I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my kitchen chair and wedged it under the door handle, then ran to my bedroom window that faced the street. The 911 operator was still on the line, now saying units were on the way, 2 minutes out, but I could hear my deadbolt starting to turn. I yanked open the window and started screaming into the night. "Help! Someone help me! They're breaking in! Call 911! A couple walking their dog looked up, confused at first. Then the woman pulled out her phone when she saw my panic. The deadbolt clicked open, but the chair held for a moment, the door jamming against it as they pushed from the outside. I ran to my kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find, still screaming, making as much noise as possible. And that's when I heard the beautiful sound of sirens in the distance. The pushing against my door stopped abruptly, and I heard quick footsteps in the hallway, Grant's voice saying, "Go, go, go," and then doors slamming. Through my peephole, I could see the hallway was empty, but I didn't move that chair or open that door until I saw the police officers' uniforms through the peephole 5 minutes later. When I finally let them in, I was shaking so badly I could barely stand, and one officer had to help me to my couch while I explained everything that had happened. The fake emergency, the coordinated trap, how they'd clearly been planning to take me into Grant's apartment for God knows what purpose. The police found Grant's apartment exactly as I'd described. His phone was still on the coffee table with a voice recording app open, showing multiple saved files with my name in them, recordings of him saying different emergency scenarios. In Mr. Brennan's apartment, they found a notebook with detailed notes about all the female residents in the building, our schedules, when we had visitors, when we were alone, which ones had boyfriends, which ones didn't. My page had stars next to it, and a note that said 3rd floor, minimal foot traffic Saturdays. The big man in coveralls had vanished, but they found out from the landlord that Grant had indeed convinced him to give him a master key, claiming he needed it to help elderly residents when the landlord was unavailable. They arrested Grant and Mr. Brennan that night. Grant tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, that he really did have someone injured in his apartment, but the complete absence of any blood or injured person, plus the recording equipment and Brennan's stalking notebook, told a different story. I moved out 3 days later, stayed with a friend while I found a new place, and I still check every lock twice before I sleep. The district attorney told me they'd both taken plea deals to avoid trial. Grant got 8 years for attempted kidnapping and conspiracy. Brennan got 6 years. They never found the third man, which honestly still keeps me up some nights, wondering if he's out there somewhere. Maybe in another building, maybe trying the same thing with some other woman who lives alone. The detective on the case told me I probably saved my own life by making so much noise and calling 911 immediately, instead of going to help. Said they'd seen similar cases where women disappeared after being lured by fake emergencies. I share this story whenever I can, especially to other women living alone, because that helpful instinct, that desire to assist a neighbor in crisis, is exactly what predators like them count on. And sometimes the best thing you can do is trust that uncomfortable feeling and make that call instead of opening your door. Last year around this time, everything in my life went from normal to absolutely terrifying in a matter of weeks, and it all started with me asking my neighbor to turn down his music. At 34, raising my 8-year-old daughter Chloe by myself in Columbus, Ohio wasn't always easy, but we'd found our rhythm in this modest apartment complex off Hamilton Road. My job as a dental hygienist kept us comfortable enough. Not rich by any means, but we could afford our 2-bedroom ground floor unit and still have money left over for Chloe's dance classes every Saturday. After my divorce 2 years earlier, this place felt like our sanctuary, a fresh start where nobody knew our business and we could just be ourselves. Building C, apartment 12, had become our little haven, surrounded by mostly older residents and young families who smiled politely in passing, but minded their own business. We'd been there 8 months without a single issue, which made what happened next even more shocking. Everything changed when Dustin moved into apartment 14 right next door to us in early September. 22 years old, according to the maintenance guy who loved to gossip, Dustin looked exactly like you'd expect a kid fresh out of college to look, skinny as a rail, patchy facial hair that desperately wanted to be a beard, always wearing these ratty band shirts for groups I'd never heard of. His parents must have been helping with rent because there was no way someone his age could afford this place on their own, not with the fancy gaming setup I saw him hauling in through his door. For about a week, things were fine. I'd see him checking his mail or heading out with a backpack slung over one shoulder, and we'd exchange those awkward neighbor nods. But then came the music, and holy hell, this wasn't just someone playing their stereo a bit too loud. Every night starting at 11 on the dot, right when Chloe and I were settling into bed, these pounding bass lines would shake our entire apartment like we lived next door to a nightclub. After 2 weeks of this torture, with Chloe falling asleep in class and me messing up at work from pure exhaustion, I finally worked up the courage to knock on his door. It was a Saturday afternoon, around 2 o'clock, and I could hear him moving around in there playing video games. Lots of shooting sounds and him yelling at someone through a headset. I knocked 3 times before he answered, and when he finally opened the door, He only cracked it about 6 inches, peering at me through the gap like I was trying to sell him something. His apartment reeked of weed and energy drinks, and I could see empty pizza boxes stacked on every surface behind him. I put on my friendliest smile, introduced myself properly as his neighbor from apartment 12, and explained as politely as possible that the late-night music was keeping my daughter awake on school nights. I even made sure to say please, mentioned that I understood he was young and probably didn't realize how thin these walls were, and asked if he could maybe use headphones after 10 p.m. His reaction should have been my first warning sign that something was seriously wrong with this kid. Instead of apologizing or even acknowledging what I'd said, he just stared at me for this long, uncomfortable moment, his eyes moving slowly from my face down to my feet and back up again. Not in a checking me out way, but more like he was memorizing every detail about me, filing it away for later. When he finally spoke, his voice was this weird monotone, completely flat. Nobody else has complained. That was it. No sorry. No acknowledgement that maybe blasting music at 2 a.m. might disturb people. Just that one sentence delivered like a robot. I tried again, keeping my voice light and friendly, explaining that my daughter was only 8 and really needed her sleep for school. He tilted his head slightly like a confused dog and said, "Sounds like a you problem, not a me problem." Then he shut the door in my face. Not slammed it. Just calmly, slowly closed it while maintaining eye contact through the shrinking gap until it clicked shut. That night, the music was louder than ever, and I swear he'd moved his speakers right up against our shared wall. But it wasn't just regular music anymore. He was playing the same song on repeat for hours, this heavy metal track with someone screaming about violence and revenge. Chloe was in tears, covering her ears with her pillow, and I finally had enough. I called the apartment complex's after-hours line and filed a noise complaint, giving them all the details about my attempt to resolve it directly with him first. The security guy who answered said he'd send someone over to talk to Dustin. And sure enough, about 30 minutes later the music stopped completely. I thought that would be the end of it, that maybe getting talked to by management would make him realize he couldn't act like he owned the place. Chloe finally fell asleep around midnight, and I remember lying in my bed feeling relieved that I'd stood up for us, that things would go back to normal now. Monday morning, I opened my door to take Chloe to school and found our welcome mat covered in what looked like dog crap, smeared deep into the fibers with a stick or something. The smell hit us immediately, and Chloe started gagging while I tried to shield her from seeing it properly. But here's the thing. Nobody in our building had dogs. It was against the lease agreement, which meant someone had deliberately brought this here and rubbed it into our mat. I had to throw the whole thing in the dumpster and scrub our doorstep with bleach while Chloe waited in the car, making us 20 minutes late. When I got home from work that evening, I found a note tucked into our door frame, printed in block letters. "Karma's a bitch." No signature, of course, but I knew exactly who it was from. I kept the note, took pictures of everything, and emailed the apartment management company, but their response was basically that without proof it was him, they couldn't do anything except keep an eye on the situation. Within a week, things escalated in ways I never could have imagined. First, I started hearing rumors from other neighbors. Apparently, Dustin had been telling people I was a prostitute who brought men home while my daughter was sleeping. Mrs. Garrett from apartment 16, this sweet elderly lady who used to babysit Chloe sometimes, actually pulled me aside near the mailboxes to ask if I was in some kind of trouble and needed help. When I asked what she meant, she got all flustered and said Dustin had warned her to be careful around me because I was involved in dangerous activities and had questionable men coming and going at all hours. I was mortified. This 70-year-old woman who'd baked cookies for Chloe was now looking at me like I might be running some kind of escort service out of my living room. I tried explaining what was really happening, but I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. The seed of doubt had been planted, and Dustin knew exactly what he was doing by targeting the building gossip. Then came the packages. Every few days, I'd get these deliveries I never ordered. Adult toys from websites I'd never even heard of. all addressed to me with my full name but paid for with prepaid cards so they couldn't be traced. The delivery guys would smirk or avoid eye contact when I answered the door, and I knew they could see what company names were on the boxes. One afternoon, Chloe answered the door before I could stop her and asked me why someone sent us a package from Lover's Paradise. Try explaining that to an 8-year-old. I started refusing deliveries, but then they'd just get left on our doorstep for everyone to see. The worst part was when these catalogs started arriving in my mailbox. Hardcore adult material mixed in with my regular mail, stuff so explicit that I had to grab the mail before Chloe could see it. All of it was addressed to me personally, like I'd signed up for subscriptions. I was basically being slut-shamed by a kid who probably hadn't even had a real girlfriend yet. Everything came to a head on a Friday evening in early November. Chloe was at her dad's for the weekend, which was the only reason I hadn't completely lost it yet. At least she was getting breaks from this nightmare every other week. I'd just gotten home from work, exhausted and dreading what new hell might be waiting for me, when I noticed my living room curtains looked weird from outside. Getting closer, I realized they were slightly parted, which was strange because I always kept them perfectly closed now, paranoid about giving Dustin any view into our apartment. As I walked up to fix them, something moved in the gap, a quick flash of light being pulled back. My chest got tight as I carefully approached the window from the side, staying out of direct view, and peeked through a tiny corner of the curtain. There was Dustin, standing at his window with his phone raised, recording through the 3-inch gap in my curtains. He was so focused on trying to see inside my apartment that he didn't notice me watching him watch me. I banged on the window hard enough to rattle the frame, and I'll never forget the expression on his face when he realized he'd been caught. Instead of looking embarrassed or scared, he smiled, this slow, deliberate grin that made my stomach turn to ice. He kept his phone pointed at me and actually waved with his free hand, mouthing words I couldn't make out through the glass. I yanked my curtains completely closed and immediately called 911, but by the time the cops showed up 15 minutes later, Dustin was back inside his apartment, claiming he'd been gaming all evening and had no idea what I was talking about. The officers took my statement but said that without the actual footage or him still being at the window, it was just my word against his. One of them, this younger cop who seemed genuinely concerned, suggested I look into getting security cameras and maybe staying somewhere else for a while if I felt unsafe. But where was I supposed to go? This was our home, and I couldn't afford to just pick up and move. That night changed everything for me. I decided I was done being a victim and started planning my counterattack. First thing Saturday morning, I drove to Best Buy and maxed out my credit card on security equipment. 4 cameras that could record in night vision, motion sensor lights for our doorway, and this doorbell camera that sent alerts straight to my phone. I spent the entire day installing everything myself, YouTube tutorials playing on repeat while I drilled holes and ran cables. I also did something else. I started documenting everything obsessively. Every weird noise, every time I saw him watching me, every piece of trash that mysteriously appeared on our doorstep went into a notebook with dates, times, and photos. I created a Gmail account just for evidence, forwarding myself everything so there'd be timestamps. Within 3 days, I had him on camera twice, once leaving another disgusting gift on our doormat at 3 a.m., and once standing outside our window for 20 minutes just staring at our apartment. The footage was crystal clear, his face perfectly visible in the infrared light. Armed with all this evidence, I marched into the property management office and demanded to speak with the regional manager, not the useless site supervisor who'd been ignoring me. I laid out everything: the videos, the photos, the notebook, printed emails showing my previous complaints, even testimonies from 2 neighbors who'd witnessed him lurking around our door. I told them either they evicted him or I'd be calling a lawyer about their failure to provide a safe living environment for my child. And I'd make sure every potential tenant knew about it on every review site that existed. Apparently, that did the trick because within a week, Dustin received an eviction notice for lease violations, including harassment of other tenants and creating a disturbance. He had 30 days to get out, and during that time, There was a cop car parked in our complex lot. Almost every night after I'd explained the situation to them. Dustin moved out on day 29, loading his stuff into a U-Haul while shooting me dirty looks from across the parking lot. The new neighbor who moved in is a quiet nursing student who bakes brownies for everyone on the floor. I still have those cameras up though, and I check them every single night before bed. Some habits are hard to break when someone made you feel that unsafe in your own home. Most people think neighborly disputes are just minor annoyances that work themselves out eventually. I used to believe that too, until last spring when everything spiraled completely out of control with the guy living next door. I was 34 at the time, had just gotten promoted to regional manager at a logistics company, and my wife Natalie and I were settling into our first real house in a quiet suburb outside Portland. We'd moved in about 6 months earlier, right after Christmas, and everything seemed perfect. Good schools for when we decided to have kids, a decent-sized backyard, and what we thought were friendly neighbors. The previous owners had warned us that the guy next door, Frank Garrison, could be particular about property lines, but we figured that just meant he liked to keep his lawn neat. If only we'd known what that really meant, maybe we could have handled things differently from the start. The whole nightmare began on a Saturday morning in early May, when I needed to leave for an important golf meeting with potential clients. I grabbed my coffee, kissed Natalie goodbye, and headed to the garage only to find a massive Ford F-350 blocking my entire driveway. Not partially blocking it, the truck was parked completely perpendicular across the entrance, like someone had deliberately positioned it to make it impossible for anyone to get in or out. Frank was standing in his front yard, casually watering his petunias like nothing was wrong, wearing those same faded overalls he wore every weekend. When I walked over and politely asked him to move his truck, he just kept watering, didn't even glance in my direction. I explained that I had an important meeting and really needed to leave, trying to keep my voice friendly and reasonable. That's when he finally turned to face me, and I'll never forget the look in his eyes, completely blank, like he was staring through me at something only he could see. He set down his hose real slow, walked right up to me until our faces were maybe 6 inches apart, and said in this eerily calm voice, "Your wife parked 2 inches over my property line last week. 2 inches. This is what happens when people don't respect boundaries." I tried to de-escalate, apologizing for the parking issue even though I had no idea what he was talking about, and asked him again to please move his truck. But Frank just stood there, breathing heavily through his nose, his breath smelling like stale cigarettes and something medicinal, maybe cough syrup. After what felt like an eternity, he walked to his truck, started it up, and moved it about 3 feet, still blocking most of my driveway but technically leaving just enough space for me to squeeze out if I drove over part of my lawn. When I protested that this wasn't really moving it, he turned around and started screaming at the top of his lungs, his face turning this deep purple color, veins bulging in his neck. "You people think you own the whole goddamn neighborhood. First the property line, now you're telling me where I can park on a public street?" The transformation was instant and terrifying, from dead calm to explosive rage in seconds. Several neighbors came out to see what was happening, including Mrs. Jeffries from across the street, but nobody intervened. They all just watched from their porches, and I noticed how they avoided making eye contact with Frank, like they knew something I didn't. That afternoon, after I got home from my meeting, which went terribly because I arrived 40 minutes late and flustered, things got worse. Every time Frank saw me through a window or in the yard, he'd start shouting obscenities, calling me names I won't repeat here, accusing me of trying to steal his land, of conspiring with the city to change property lines, completely unhinged stuff that made no sense. Natalie wanted to call the police, but I convinced her to wait, thinking maybe he was having a bad day or dealing with some personal issues and would calm down by tomorrow. Around dinner time, we heard this rhythmic banging on our fence. Frank was out there with a hammer, not exactly hitting the fence but tapping it repeatedly, walking the entire length of our shared boundary, tap, 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 over and over. When I went outside to ask what he was doing, he said he was checking for weak spots, and that good fences make good neighbors, but weak fences invite trespassers. The way he emphasized trespassers while staring directly at me made it clear this was a threat, not maintenance. The real terror started that night around 2 a.m. when we woke up to pounding on our front door. Not knocking, but full force pounding like someone trying to break it down. Natalie grabbed my arm so tight her nails dug into my skin as we lay there in bed, both of us too scared to move at first. The pounding went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped, then started again, this time accompanied by Frank's voice shouting about his property, about respect, about how we needed to learn our place. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept in the closet and crept downstairs, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Through the peephole, I could see Frank standing there in just his boxers and a tank top, his fist raised to pound again, his face contorted with rage even though his eyes looked almost vacant, like he wasn't completely there. When I shouted through the door that I was calling 911, he stopped mid-swing, lowered his fist slowly, and walked backward off our porch, never turning around, just walking backward all the way to his house while maintaining eye contact with our door. The whole thing was so bizarre and unsettling that even after he went inside, Natalie and I sat in our living room with all the lights on until sunrise, too anxious to go back to sleep. The next morning, a Sunday, we found dozens of nails scattered across our driveway, not randomly dropped, but carefully placed pointing upward, positioned right where our tires would hit them when backing out. I spent an hour picking them all up while Frank sat on his porch in a lawn chair, drinking beer at 8 a.m., and watching me with this satisfied expression. When Natalie came out to help me, he started making these crude comments about her appearance, loud enough for us to hear but not quite yelling, describing what she was wearing and making suggestions about what she should wear instead. That was my breaking point. I marched over to confront him, but before I could say anything, he stood up and pulled out his phone, claiming he was recording me for evidence of harassment. He kept backing away while filming, narrating to his phone that I was aggressively approaching him on his property, even though I hadn't even left my driveway yet. Then he started calling out to invisible witnesses, yelling, "Someone help! This man is threatening me!" Even though the street was empty and I hadn't said a single word. We finally called the police that afternoon, and 2 officers showed up about an hour later. But here's where things got even more frustrating. Frank transformed completely when they arrived. He put on this whole performance, speaking softly and respectfully, showing them documentation about property lines he'd apparently been collecting for months, even producing a surveyor's report from 2016 that showed our fence was allegedly 3 inches over his property line. He had photos on his phone that he claimed showed our repeated violations, though when I looked at them later during the report, they were just pictures of our car parked normally in our own driveway, Natalie gardening in our own yard, and me mowing our own lawn. The officers seemed tired and uninterested, telling us it was a civil matter, that neighbors needed to work these things out between themselves. Frank stood behind them the whole time with this smug smile, nodding along like a concerned citizen just trying to protect his property rights. After they left, he walked to our shared fence and whispered through the slats, "They never help. They never do anything. It's just you and me now." That evening, things took an even darker turn when Natalie's sister Amy came over for dinner with her 2 kids. Frank must have been watching because the moment their car pulled up, he came outside and started his routine. First the shouting about property lines, then escalating to personal attacks. But when he saw the kids, 8-year-old twins, getting out of the car, something shifted in his demeanor. He walked right up to our property line and started talking directly to them, ignoring Amy's attempts to shield them, telling them their aunt and uncle were bad people who steal from their neighbors, asking them if they knew what happened to thieves, if they'd ever seen someone get punished for stealing. The kids were terrified, clinging to their mother as she rushed them inside. Frank followed along his side of the property line, continuing his monologue about punishment and justice, his voice getting louder and more agitated. When Amy's husband Brian arrived later and confronted Frank about scaring the children, Frank just laughed and said kids needed to learn about consequences early, that it was actually good parenting to expose them to real-world situations. Monday morning brought a new horror when I discovered Frank had called my workplace. My boss pulled me aside first thing and asked if everything was okay at home, saying a concerned neighbor had called claiming I was having violent episodes, that he'd heard screaming and breaking glass from our house at all hours. Frank had given them his full name and contact information, presenting himself as a worried citizen, even suggesting they might want to check if I was fit for a management position given my apparent instability at home. I had to spend 2 hours in HR explaining the situation, showing them the police report we'd filed, and even then I could tell they were looking at me differently. When I got home that evening, Frank was pressure washing his driveway, and as soon as he saw me, he turned the spray toward our property line, not quite hitting our house but sending a fine mist over our front windows. He kept this up for 3 hours straight, the constant drone of the machine making it impossible to hear our TV or have a conversation. Every time we looked outside, he'd wave cheerfully like we were best friends, then redirect the spray a little closer to our property. The breaking point came on Wednesday night when Frank showed up at our back door. Not the front door this time, but actually in our backyard, his face pressed against our kitchen window while we were eating dinner. Natalie screamed and dropped her plate, and I immediately ran for my phone to call 911. But Frank started talking through the glass, his breath fogging it up, saying he'd seen someone suspicious in our backyard and just wanted to make sure we were safe. He claimed the gate was open. It wasn't, I always kept it locked, and he was just being a good neighbor checking on us. By the time the police arrived 20 minutes later, Frank was back on his property, calmly explaining to the officers that he'd seen what looked like a prowler and was just trying to help. He even showed them a flashlight and said he'd called out several times before entering our yard, which was a complete lie. The officers gave him a warning about trespassing but seemed to buy his Good Samaritan act, especially when he mentioned his concern about rising crime in the neighborhood and produced a printed article about a break-in that happened 6 miles away 3 months ago. That's when I decided to take matters into my own hands and started documenting everything myself. I installed security cameras covering every angle of our property, bought a video doorbell, and started keeping a detailed log of every incident with dates and times. Natalie thought I was becoming obsessed, and maybe I was, but I needed evidence that couldn't be disputed. The very next day, I caught Frank on camera at 3 a.m. using a slingshot to shoot small rocks at our bedroom window. Not hard enough to break it, but just enough to make a tapping sound that would wake us up. When I reviewed the footage, I could see him doing this methodically, shooting once every few minutes for almost an hour, then walking back to his house like nothing happened. I also caught him on camera opening our mailbox and rifling through our mail, though he never took anything, just looked at each piece and put it back. Armed with this evidence, I went to the police station in person and insisted on filing charges. The desk sergeant watched the videos, took my statement, and actually seemed to take it seriously this time. They sent a detective to talk to Frank that afternoon, and for a brief moment, I thought we might finally get some peace. But Frank must have realized I had cameras now because his tactics changed. Instead of direct harassment, he started doing things just barely within legal limits, mowing his lawn at 6 a.m. every single day, right along our bedroom wall, playing talk radio at maximum volume in his garage with the door open facing our house, burning trash in his backyard fire pit whenever we had our windows open, creating the most noxious smoke that would fill our house. Then came the grand finale last Friday. I woke up to find my car covered in what looked like honey or syrup, completely coated from hood to trunk, with birdseed scattered all over it. By the time I discovered it, there were hundreds of birds swarming my car, pecking at it, leaving scratches all over the paint. But here's the thing. The cameras showed nothing. Somehow Frank had found their blind spots, or maybe he'd hired someone else to do it, I don't know. When I confronted him, he just shrugged and suggested maybe I should park in my garage instead of the driveway, then added with a smile that nature can be unpredictable sometimes. That weekend I did something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. Cost me $2,000, but within 3 days he found out what nobody in the neighborhood would tell me directly. Frank had done this before, twice. Once in Phoenix 8 years ago, where he'd harassed a family so relentlessly they broke their lease and fled in the middle of the night, and once in Eugene where he'd been arrested for stalking but got off on a technicality because the victims had moved away and wouldn't return to testify. The investigator also discovered Frank was on disability for a workplace head injury from 2015, which might explain the erratic behavior, but didn't excuse it. Armed with this information and a thick folder of documentation, I went to a lawyer who specialized in harassment cases. She took one look at everything and said we had enough for both a restraining order and a civil suit. The court date was set for the following Monday, and Frank was served papers that Saturday morning. I watched from my window as the process server handed him the documents, and for the first time since this all started, I saw genuine surprise on his face. He stood in his doorway reading them for a full 10 minutes, his expression shifting from confusion to what looked like panic. Sunday was eerily quiet. No lawn mowing, no loud music, no harassment at all. Frank's truck never left his driveway, and his blinds stayed closed all day. Monday morning at the courthouse, Frank showed up looking disheveled, representing himself, trying to argue that this was all a misunderstanding between neighbors. But when the judge saw the videos, read the police reports, and heard about his history in other states, she granted the restraining order immediately. Frank had to stay 100 feet away from us and our property, which meant he couldn't even use his own backyard or the side of his house facing ours. The judge gave him 30 days to find alternative living arrangements. As we left the courthouse, Frank didn't say a word, didn't even look at us, just stood there staring at the ground. Within 2 weeks, a for sale sign went up in his yard, and by the end of the month, he was gone. The new neighbors, a retired couple named the Washburns, are lovely people who brought us cookies the day they moved in and always wave when they see us. Sometimes I still check the cameras at night, though, and Natalie says I get tense whenever I hear unexpected noises outside. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't in horror movies. They're living right next door, hiding behind property lines and false politeness, waiting for the smallest excuse to make your life hell. I was hunched over my laptop trying to finish a logo design when the ceiling started shaking so hard that my coffee mug walked itself right off the desk. 7 a.m. on a Saturday in Milwaukee, and my upstairs neighbor Calvin had decided to blast dubstep at concert volume. I'm 28, been doing freelance graphic design for my one-bedroom apartment for about 2 years now, and up until that day, my biggest problems were usually just meeting client deadlines or remembering to eat something besides cereal for dinner. 6 months earlier, I'd signed the lease on this place in a converted 1940s warehouse, all exposed brick and creaky hardwood floors, radiators that sounded like medieval torture devices when the heat kicked on. The landlord had promised a quiet, professional community, and for the most part, he'd been right. People here minded their own business, which worked perfectly for someone who spent most days in pajama pants, cycling between my desk and the coffee maker. Calvin had moved in about 2 months after me, taking the unit directly above mine. Mid-30s guy with this patchy beard that looked like he'd lost interest halfway through growing it, always wearing these faded band shirts with mysterious stains and holes in weird places. We'd only had 2 interactions before that Saturday. Once when a package of his got delivered to my door, some kind of audio equipment from the return label, and another time in the basement laundry room where he just stood there watching me load my washer, not responding when I tried to make conversation about the perpetually broken dryer. The music had been going since I woke up, but by 10 a.m. it had gotten so loud that my ceiling fan was visibly wobbling, and I could feel each bass drop in my ribcage like a second heartbeat. My client's logo was due Monday morning, and I couldn't string 2 thoughts together with what sounded like an underground rave happening 8 feet above my head. I'd been putting off going upstairs for hours, hoping he'd eventually turn it down on his own or leave for work or something. But by noon, after I'd accidentally typed "Make it stop" in 72-point font on my client's logo, I knew I had to do something. I practiced what I'd say in my head while climbing the stairs. Keep it friendly, maybe mention the thin floors, suggest some compromise about quiet hours. The hallway on the 3rd floor always smelled weird, like wet cardboard mixed with something chemical, and Calvin's door had these deep scratches near the bottom that I'd never noticed before. When I knocked, the music cut off instantly, like he'd been standing right there waiting. The sudden silence made my ears ring. Through the door, I could hear breathing, heavy and deliberate, but he didn't open it for what felt like a full minute. When he finally did, just a crack with the chain still on, one bloodshot eye peered out at me, and I noticed his apartment behind him was completely dark, except for the glow of multiple computer monitors. "Hey, Calvin," I started, trying to keep my voice steady and pleasant. "I'm really sorry to bother you, but the music is pretty loud and I'm trying to work on a project. Would you mind turning it down just a bit?" His visible eye didn't blink once while I talked, just stayed locked on my face like he was memorizing every detail. His breathing got heavier, and I could smell something sour wafting out from his apartment, like spoiled milk mixed with sweat. "You trying to tell me what to do in my own home?" he finally said, his voice raspier than I remembered, like he'd been screaming or hadn't spoken in days. No, I'm just asking if you could maybe..." But he slammed the door so hard that one of his neighbors, Mrs. Nguyen, poked her head out to see what was happening. She gave me this sympathetic look and quickly retreated back inside. As I stood there, still processing what just happened, the music started again, somehow even louder than before, and I heard him laughing through the door. Not a normal laugh, but this hollow, rhythmic sound that went on way too long. The rest of Saturday was hell. Every time I'd start to concentrate, he'd drop something heavy right above wherever I was sitting, like he was tracking my movements through the floor. Around 3 p.m., I tried calling the landlord, Mr. Reeves, but got his voicemail. He was probably at his cabin up north like he was every weekend. I left a message trying to sound calm and reasonable, explaining the situation, but I could hear my voice getting higher and tighter as I talked. Then things got weirder. Calvin started stomping in patterns. 3 heavy steps, pause, 3 more steps, pause, for 20 minutes straight. When that stopped, he began dragging furniture across his floor, back and forth, the scraping sound like nails on a chalkboard. I tried putting on my noise-canceling headphones, but somehow the vibrations still came through, rattling up through my chair and into my spine. By evening, I gave up on work and ordered Thai food, figuring I'd just try to relax and deal with it tomorrow. The delivery driver, this young kid with braces, looked nervous when he got to my door. "That your boyfriend upstairs?" he asked while I signed the receipt. "What? No, why?" I said, and he shifted uncomfortably. Dude was standing in his window when I pulled up, just staring down at the street. Soon as he saw me coming to your door, he started hitting the glass with something. Made me jump. The kid practically ran back to his car, and when I looked up at Calvin's window, the blind snapped shut. I went inside and tried to eat my pad thai, but my appetite was gone. Around 9 p.m., the music finally stopped, replaced by something worse. Calvin talking to himself upstairs, his voice rising and falling like he was having an argument with someone who wasn't there. I could make out fragments through the ceiling. "Thinks she can control me. Showed her. Not gonna take it." Then I heard my name, clear as day, followed by a string of words that made my whole body go rigid with fear. Sunday morning came with a new form of harassment. At 5 a.m., Calvin started playing audio through his speakers, a recording of my phone conversation with Mr. Reeves from yesterday, but slowed down and distorted so my voice sounded demonic. He had somehow recorded me through the floor or walls. He played it on loop for an hour straight while I lay in bed, paralyzed with the realization that he'd been listening to everything I did. When I finally got up and went to make coffee, I found a note that had been slid under my door during the night. It was written in red marker on a piece of notebook paper torn raggedly from a spiral binding. "Noise complaint filed against you. 2 can play this game." My apartment's doorknob had some kind of greasy substance smeared on it that I hadn't noticed when I'd grabbed it earlier. I washed my hands 3 times, feeling sick. The walls started to feel too close, the air too thick. I called my sister in Madison, begging to stay with her for a few days, but she was out of town until Wednesday for work. By Sunday afternoon, Calvin had escalated to following my footsteps from above, staying directly over me wherever I moved in my apartment. Kitchen to bathroom, bathroom to bedroom, bedroom to living room. His heavy steps shadowed mine perfectly. When I sat still, he would stand right above me and bounce on his heels, making the ceiling creak rhythmically. I tried leaving to get some air and maybe work from a coffee shop, but when I opened my door, Calvin was standing at the top of the stairs, just out of sight around the corner. I could see his shadow and hear his breathing. "Going somewhere?" He called down in that raspy voice, and I heard him take one step down, then another. I slammed my door shut and locked it, adding the chain for good measure. Through the peephole, I watched his distorted figure come down and stand directly in front of my door for 5 entire minutes. Not moving, not speaking, just breathing loud enough for me to hear. Mrs. Nguyen's door opened briefly, then immediately closed again with the sound of multiple locks engaging. That Sunday night was when Calvin completely lost it. Around 11 p.m., just as I was trying to convince myself to get some sleep, he started slamming something heavy against his floor, my ceiling, with methodical precision. Boom, 10 seconds, boom, 10 seconds, boom. Dust and small pieces of plaster began falling onto my bed. Then came his voice through the air vents, crystal clear, like he was speaking directly into them. "You ruined everything. You couldn't just mind your own business. Now you'll learn what happens when you disrespect me." The slamming stopped, replaced by the sound of him screaming. Not words, just pure, animalistic rage that went on for so long I thought his throat would give out. Other neighbors must have heard it too, because I could hear doors opening and closing in the hallway, muffled voices discussing whether to call someone. But nobody did. We all just waited in our separate boxes, hoping it would stop. At 2 a.m., the pounding started on my door. Not knocking, pounding with what sounded like both fists, maybe even kicking. The whole frame shook, and I could see the chain lock straining with each impact. "Open the door! I know you're in there! We need to talk about respect!" Calvin's voice was completely unhinged now, hoarse from screaming but still going. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering to the dispatcher while huddled in my bathroom with the door locked. The pounding got harder, and I heard wood splintering. Through all the noise, I could hear Mrs. Nguyen's voice in the hallway. "I'm calling the police, you need to stop." Calvin responded by turning his rage on her, and I heard her door slam shut. The 911 dispatcher stayed on the line with me, saying units were 3 minutes away. But those were the longest 3 minutes of my life. The pounding reached a fever pitch, and I was certain the door would give way any second. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and stood behind my couch, shaking so badly I could barely hold it. The sirens arrived just as I heard the first crack of wood giving way near my door's deadbolt. Calvin must have heard them too, because the pounding suddenly stopped, followed by the sound of his heavy footsteps running up the stairs. The police, 2 officers, knocked and identified themselves, and I nearly collapsed with relief when I opened what was left of my door. The frame was destroyed, with deep dents and gouges in the wood, splinters all over my hallway floor. They took my statement while 2 other officers went upstairs to Calvin's unit. I could hear them knocking, announcing themselves, then nothing. One officer came back down and told me Calvin wasn't answering. They couldn't force entry without a warrant unless they believed someone was in immediate danger. They said they'd file a report and suggested I stay somewhere else for the night. As they were leaving, one younger officer pulled me aside and quietly said, "That door won't keep anyone out now. Don't stay here tonight." I packed a bag with shaking fingers and called an Uber to take me to a motel near the airport, the kind where they don't ask questions and you can pay in cash. The next morning, Monday, I returned with my brother-in-law, Keith, a construction worker who took one look at my door and said we needed to leave immediately and call the landlord. Mr. Reeves finally showed up around noon, took one look at the damage and went pale. Turns out Calvin had been evicted from his last 3 apartments for similar behavior. But somehow that hadn't shown up in the background check. Calvin had disappeared that night. His apartment was empty except for dozens of holes punched in the walls, and my name written in what looked like permanent marker on every surface. The police found recording equipment aimed at the floor and hours of audio files on his computer. They issued a restraining order, but Calvin never showed up to claim his stuff or his security deposit. I moved out 2 weeks later, staying with my sister until I found a new place. Sometimes I still hear phantom footsteps above me, even though I live on the top floor now. The police never found Calvin, and that's what keeps me awake some nights, knowing he's still out there somewhere, probably living above someone else. The house next door used to be quiet until the Andersons moved in last August. I was 8 months pregnant then, waddling around our backyard trying to set up the nursery furniture my husband Craig had assembled wrong twice already. We'd bought this place in the suburbs of Charlotte specifically for the big fenced yard, the good schools, the safe neighborhood where kids could play outside. The Andersons seemed nice enough at first, mid-20s couple, drove a beat-up Subaru with hiking stickers all over the back window. They waved when they moved in, apologized for the noise from the U-Haul. Normal neighbor stuff. Then came their first dog, a massive German Shepherd mix they called Thor. No big deal, lots of people have dogs around here, but Thor wasn't like the golden retriever 2 houses down or the little beagle across the street. Within a week I noticed Thor was always in their backyard, never on walks, just pacing along the fence line like he was plotting something. The Andersons' yard started changing too. Patches of dead grass appeared where Thor did his business, and nobody ever seemed to clean it up. By September, they'd added a second dog, some kind of pit bull mix with one blue eye and one brown eye that made him look permanently unhinged. They called him Diesel. Now I had 2 huge dogs barking at all hours, charging the fence whenever I tried to water my tomatoes. Craig said I was being paranoid, that pregnancy was making me anxious about everything. But I knew something was wrong with how those dogs acted. The way they'd go silent and still whenever I walked past, tracking me with their eyes like I was prey. Baby Ella arrived in early September, and that's when things got worse. The day we brought her home from the hospital, 3 more dogs had appeared in the Andersons' yard. A boxer with a scarred face, a husky that never stopped howling, and something that looked like a Rottweiler mixed with a small bear. 5 dogs total now, none of them fixed, none of them trained. The smell from their yard started drifting into our windows even when they were closed. I watched from our kitchen as the dogs established a pack hierarchy, fighting over food, mounting each other, tearing apart anything the Andersons left outside. They'd destroyed a patio set within 2 days, leaving twisted metal and shredded cushions scattered across the dirt. The fence between our yards was only 4 feet high. I'd seen Thor clear it once already when he was chasing a squirrel into our garden. The first real incident happened on a Monday morning in late September. I was in the nursery changing Ella when I heard this wet, heavy breathing right outside the window. Diesel had jumped the fence and was standing in our side yard, his mismatched eyes fixed on the window, tongue hanging out and dripping saliva onto our newly planted hydrangeas. He just stood there for maybe 5 minutes, not moving except for his chest heaving with each breath. I grabbed my phone to call Craig, but by the time I looked back, Diesel was gone. When I checked the yard later, there were deep scratches in the dirt beneath Ella's window, like he'd been trying to dig down to the foundation. I found tufts of his gray fur caught on our rose bushes, and a pile of fresh feces right on our doormat, too deliberate to be random, like he was marking our house as his territory. I tried talking to the Andersons that afternoon. The wife, Bridget, answered the door wearing pajama pants with cartoon cats on them, and a tank top covered in what looked like dried dog slobber. The smell that came from inside their house hit me like a physical wall. Ammonia, rot, and something else I couldn't identify but made me want to gag. She listened to me explain about Diesel jumping the fence, nodding along with this vacant smile, her fingers twisted in her unwashed hair. "Oh yeah, he does that sometimes," she said like I was telling her about the weather. "He's just curious about the baby crying. Dogs have really good hearing, you know. He probably thinks she's a puppy or something." The casual way she said it made my chest tighten. Behind her, I could see into their living room. The hardwood floors were scratched to hell, there were holes chewed in the drywall, and one of the dogs had torn apart their couch cushions, leaving foam scattered everywhere like snow. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time Ella made a sound, I'd jolt awake thinking about what Bridget said. The dogs thinking my baby sounded like a puppy. Around 3 a.m., I heard them all start barking at once. Not their usual random noise, but synchronized, purposeful, like they were communicating. I crept to our bedroom window and peered through the blinds. All 5 dogs were lined up along our shared fence, sitting perfectly still in a row, their eyes reflecting the moonlight as they stared directly at our house. The husky, the one with ice blue eyes, had something in his mouth. Took me a second to realize it was one of Ella's toys, a stuffed rabbit we'd lost in the yard the day before. He wasn't chewing it, just holding it gently, like he was saving it. They stayed there for an hour, never barking again, never moving, just watching. I took photos on my phone, but Craig said I was overreacting when I showed him in the morning. The breaking point came on a Saturday. Craig had gone to Home Depot to buy materials for a higher fence, finally believing me after he'd seen Thor clear our fence twice in one day. I was alone with Ella, feeding her in the living room when I heard the back door creak. I always locked it, always, but there it was, slowly swinging open. The boxer appeared first, his scarred face low to the ground, muscles tensed like he was stalking something. Then came Diesel, then the Rottweiler mix. They moved through my kitchen like they owned it, sniffing everything, leaving muddy paw prints on my white tiles. The smell they brought with them was overwhelming. Wet dog mixed with feces and something rancid, like meat left in the sun. They knew exactly where they were going, heading straight for the living room where I sat frozen with Ella against my chest. The boxer's jaw was massive, his teeth yellowed and sharp when he pulled his lips back in what wasn't quite a growl, but wasn't friendly either. I held Ella tighter, her tiny body warm against mine while these 3 enormous dogs formed a semicircle around my chair. The Rottweiler mix kept making this low rumbling sound in his chest. Not quite a growl, but something primitive that made every instinct scream at me to run. But I couldn't move, couldn't risk triggering their prey drive. Diesel came closest, his blue and brown eyes never leaving Ella's face. He leaned in, his nose almost touching her blanket, nostrils flaring as he took in her scent. His breath was hot and smelled like rotting garbage. Then he did something that still makes me sick to remember. He licked his lips slowly, deliberately, the same way my old dog used to when I was preparing his dinner. The boxer started pacing, his claws clicking on the hardwood, circling us like he was looking for the best angle of approach. For 10 minutes, maybe 15, they just studied us, learning our scents, memorizing our fear. The only sound was their breathing and Ella starting to fuss, probably sensing my terror. Then Ella started crying, that high-pitched newborn wail that sounds almost like an animal in distress. The dog's entire demeanor shifted instantly. Their ears perked up, bodies tensed, and the Rottweiler mix took a step forward, his massive head tilting as he focused on her with an intensity that made my heart pound so hard I thought I might pass out. The boxer stopped pacing and lowered into what looked like a hunting crouch, his scarred face inches from the floor, eyes locked on Ella's moving blanket. Diesel began making these short, sharp huffing sounds, like he was getting excited, working himself up for something. I tried to shush Ella, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. The more she cried, the more agitated they became, and I realized with absolute clarity that they were deciding whether she was food. Not playing, not curious. They were evaluating my 2-month-old daughter as prey. The Rottweiler's mouth opened slightly, strings of drool connecting his upper and lower jaw, and I could see every one of his teeth. That's when the husky and Thor appeared in the doorway, completing the pack. 5 massive dogs now, blocking every exit, their eyes all trained on my crying baby. The husky still had her stuffed rabbit in his mouth, but now it was mangled, wet with saliva and torn open, white stuffing spilling out like entrails. Thor, the German Shepherd mix, was the biggest of them all, probably 120 pounds, and he moved with the confidence of an alpha. He walked straight up to us, no hesitation, and put his enormous head right next to Ella. I could feel his breath on my arm, see the pulse in his neck, watch his nose twitch as he processed her scent. Then he made a sound I'll never forget, this deep, guttural rumble that seemed to come from somewhere ancient, something that triggered every evolutionary alarm in my brain. The other dogs responded immediately, forming a tighter circle, and I knew with absolute certainty that if I moved wrong, if I showed fear, if I did anything to trigger them, they would attack. My phone was on the side table, just out of reach, and Craig wouldn't be home for at least another hour. I did the only thing I could think of. I started humming. Not a lullaby, but this deep, monotonous sound from my chest, almost matching Thor's rumble. It was something I remembered from a documentary about wolves, how the mother would vocalize to establish dominance over the pack around her pups. Ridiculous, desperate. But Thor's ears twitched, and he pulled back slightly. I kept humming, louder now, adding a slight growl to it, trying to sound bigger than I was. The boxer sat down first, then Diesel, like they were confused by this new sound. I slowly stood up, still making that noise, holding Ella high against my shoulder so I seemed taller. The Rottweiler mix backed up a step. Thor watched me with those intelligent eyes, and I swear he was calculating whether I was worth challenging. For 30 seconds that felt like hours. We stayed locked in this standoff. Then I took one step toward them, still humming that weird growl song, and the husky dropped the rabbit. Another step, and the boxer whined. On my third step, Thor turned and walked out, and like magic, they all followed him, filing out through my kitchen and back door like they'd never been hunting my baby at all. The second they left, I slammed the door shut, locked it, and shoved a chair under the handle. Then I grabbed my phone and called 911, then Craig, then animal control, in that order. The police found the Andersons passed out drunk in their living room, surrounded by dog feces, empty bottles, and what turned out to be illegal drugs. The dogs had been living on cheap kibble mixed with raw ground beef that had spoiled days ago, which explained their increasing aggression. All 5 dogs were removed that day. The Andersons were arrested for animal neglect, child endangerment, and possession. Turns out they'd been collecting dogs from online free-to-good home ads, planning to breed them in some backyard puppy mill scheme, but got overwhelmed and just let them go feral. We moved 2 weeks later, didn't even wait for the house to sell. Craig finally understood why when animal control showed us photos they'd found on Bridget's phone. Dozens of pictures of our house, our yard, and most disturbing of all, zoomed-in photos of Ella through our windows, dated from before the dogs ever jumped our fence. They'd been planning something, though nobody could prove what. These days, living in our new place in Raleigh with a 6-foot privacy fence and security cameras, I still check every door twice before bed, and I can't hear a dog bark without remembering those 10 minutes when 5 untrained dogs evaluated my baby like she was their next meal. About 6 months ago, something happened that completely changed how I think about privacy and personal boundaries. I was 32 at that point, had just relocated to a quiet suburb outside Seattle for a new position as a software developer at a startup downtown. My new neighborhood was everything I'd hoped for after years of cramped apartment living. Mature oak trees lining every street, houses with actual yards and driveways, and this peaceful silence that made you forget downtown was only 20 minutes away. I'd been in my house maybe 2 weeks, still had moving boxes stacked against most walls, when Howard introduced himself. He lived in a faded yellow ranch-style house next door, probably mid-50s, always wearing these old polo shirts tucked into khaki shorts that sat too high on his waist. Our first meeting happened while I was struggling to haul a heavy dresser up my front steps alone. He materialized from nowhere, grabbed one end without asking permission, and helped me carry it inside like we'd planned it together. Howard had this peculiar way of smiling where his mouth would stretch impossibly wide, but his eyes remained completely motionless, like someone had taught him facial expressions from a diagram, but he'd never quite mastered making them look natural. After we positioned that dresser in my bedroom, he lingered on my porch for almost an hour, asking about my job, where I'd lived before, if I had family in Washington. Standard neighbor questions, except he'd lean uncomfortably close when I answered, tilting his head at odd angles like he was recording every syllable. He shared details about our street that nobody would typically notice, which houses had dogs, whose lawn sprinkler activated at what time, when garbage trucks made their rounds. His knowledge was encyclopedic but somehow unsettling. When I finally mentioned having a video conference for work, he stepped back immediately, that unnatural smile never faltering, and promised he'd stop by tomorrow to ensure I was settling in properly. I watched him walk to his house, and he turned around 3 times to wave, each time waiting until I waved back before taking another step. At first, Howard's helpfulness seemed like a blessing. Every morning around 7:30, just as I was leaving for work, he'd materialize on his porch with perfect timing, offering to grab my mail while I was gone, or reminding me about recycling day. He brought over a casserole dish one evening, said his late wife's recipe was too much for one person, and stood in my doorway describing each ingredient while I held that lukewarm dish, nodding politely. He fixed my gate latch without being asked, planted flowers along my fence because he thought it needed color, even started mowing a strip of my lawn when he did his own. Each favor came with that same rigid smile and an expectation that we'd chat afterward. He'd ask specific questions about my workday, knew which coffee shop I stopped at, commented on how late I'd gotten home. I figured he was just lonely and observant. Maybe watched the street from his window out of boredom. Retirement could do that to people, right? Everything shifted one Saturday morning when I decided to grab groceries early, hoping to avoid crowds. I'd barely pulled out of my driveway when I spotted Howard in my rearview mirror, walking briskly down the sidewalk in my direction. Coincidence, I thought, until I saw him again at the store, pushing his cart 2 aisles over, examining a box of cereal with intense concentration. When I moved to produce, he appeared minutes later by the bananas. When I went to check out, he joined the next line over with only 3 items in his cart: a single apple, a box of tissues, and breath mints. He waved enthusiastically when he noticed me, came over to comment on my food choices, actually picked up my package of chicken to check the expiration date. On my drive home, his car stayed exactly 3 vehicles behind mine. That night, while grilling dinner on my back deck, I heard him on his phone in his yard, and chills ran through my entire body when I heard him say my full name, middle name included, and describe what I was wearing, adding that I seemed to prefer blue shirts on weekends. I started paying closer attention after that phone call incident, and what I discovered made me genuinely afraid. Howard knew things he couldn't possibly know through normal observation. When I called in sick to work one day, he knocked on my door within an hour with homemade soup, mentioning he hoped my stomach bug would pass quickly. But I'd never said what was wrong, had only emailed my boss. He commented on a conference call I'd taken in my home office, specifically mentioning my coworker Jason's interesting accent. My windows had been closed, and I'd been wearing headphones. Once he asked if I'd enjoyed the Thai food I'd ordered the previous night, even describing the specific dishes I'd gotten, though the delivery driver had come to my back door at my request. He started leaving notes on my car windshield with observations. Noticed you were low on gas yesterday. There's a cheaper station on Riverside. Or, your left rear tire looks a bit low. I can help you with that. Each note included a smiley face drawn with disturbing precision, perfectly circular with symmetrical features. My breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon when I returned from visiting my brother across town. Howard was standing in my backyard, inside the fence, holding a measuring tape against my kitchen window. When he saw me, he didn't even flinch, just gave me that mechanical smile and explained he wanted to build me a bird feeder that would fit perfectly on my windowsill. Said he'd noticed I enjoyed watching the Cardinals during my morning coffee. I hadn't mentioned the Cardinals to anyone, had only stood at that window a few times. I asked him to leave, tried to keep my voice steady, but he just tilted his head and asked if I was feeling all right, mentioned that I'd been restless lately, that he'd heard me walking around at 2:47 a.m. the night before. He knew the exact time. He suggested maybe I needed more magnesium in my diet, even recommended a specific brand of supplements, said he'd noticed my shopping habits lacked proper nutrients. As he climbed back over my fence instead of using the gate, he mentioned he'd already ordered the wood for that bird feeder, that it would be a surprise for next weekend. That evening, I installed a security camera app on my phone, the kind that uses your old devices as monitors. I set up my tablet facing the front yard and my laptop watching the back, figuring I needed proof that this wasn't just paranoid thinking. Around 11 p.m., while brushing my teeth, I heard a soft scratching sound coming from outside my bathroom window. The frosted glass showed a dark shape moving slowly across it. I checked my phone's camera feed, and there was Howard, standing on a plastic crate, running his fingernail across the window screen in a deliberate pattern. He stayed there for 23 minutes, occasionally pressing his face close to the glass, his breath fogging it up in rhythmic pulses. I recorded everything, watched him finally step down, carefully return the crate to exactly where he'd taken it from beside my garbage bins, then walk back to his house while checking his watch every few steps. He stopped once to pick up a leaf from my driveway and put it in his pocket. I couldn't sleep after that, just sat in my living room with every light on, refreshing those camera feeds obsessively. Around 3 a.m., Howard emerged from his house wearing different clothes, dark sweatpants and a black hoodie I'd never seen him wear. He walked directly to my property line and stood there, perfectly still, facing my house. He didn't move for an entire hour, just stood there like a scarecrow, arms hanging at his sides. Occasionally his head would tilt slightly, like he was listening for something. At exactly 4 a.m., he walked to my mailbox, opened it, looked inside without taking anything, then closed it gently. He repeated this 3 times before walking to my car, circling it slowly while dragging his finger along the surface without quite touching it, maintaining maybe an inch of distance. He paused at my driver's side door, leaned close to the window, and I swear I saw his lips moving like he was having a conversation. He then pulled out a small notebook from his pocket, wrote something while using my car's hood as a surface, tore out the page, and slipped it under my windshield wiper. I waited until sunrise before going outside to retrieve that note, making sure Howard's car was gone first. He left every Monday at 6:15 a.m. sharp for what he'd once told me was his volunteer shift at the library. The paper was damp with morning dew, written in impossibly neat handwriting that looked almost printed. It read, "You forgot to take your vitamin D yesterday. Your kitchen light bulb will burn out in 3 days. You should call your mother, she misses you." My mother had passed away 2 years ago, something I'd never told anyone in the neighborhood. The vitamin D bottle was in my medicine cabinet, and I had indeed forgotten to take it yesterday, though I couldn't fathom how he'd know that. I went inside, locked every deadbolt, and called the police. The officer who came by, a tired-looking woman named Officer Daniels, took notes while I showed her the security footage. She watched Howard standing in my yard at 3 a.m., saw him checking my mailbox, circling my car, but her expression stayed frustratingly neutral. She said unless he actually threatened me or broke into my house, it was hard to prove criminal intent. Checking a mailbox wasn't illegal if nothing was taken. Standing in a yard could be explained away. She suggested I document everything and consider a restraining order, but warned me that neighbor disputes rarely went anywhere without concrete threats or violence. After Officer Daniels left, I decided to work from home for the rest of the week, too unsettled to maintain my normal routine. Howard must have noticed because by noon he was at my door with a container of soup. claiming he'd seen the police car and wanted to make sure everything was all right. I didn't open the door, just talked through it, told him I was fine and busy with work. He stood there for 10 minutes, occasionally saying my name in this sing-song voice, mentioning that isolation wasn't healthy, that he'd noticed I hadn't eaten breakfast, that my garbage disposal had been running for exactly 12 seconds at 9:43 a.m. Then he said something that made my whole body go rigid. He mentioned the teddy bear I kept on my dresser, the one my mom had given me as a kid, said it looked lonely sitting there facing the wall, suggested I turn it toward the bed so it could watch over me properly. My bedroom curtains had been closed for days. There was no way he could see into that room from outside. He must have been inside my house, but when? How? I demanded he leave immediately or I'd call the police again. He laughed, not his usual practiced chuckle, but this hollow sound like wind through an empty pipe, and said the police had already been here and done nothing, hadn't they? That afternoon, I called a locksmith and had every lock in my house changed, installed additional deadbolts, even put security bars on my ground floor windows. The locksmith, a burly guy named Robert, mentioned this was the third house on our street he'd done similar work for in the past year. When I asked about it, he just shook his head and muttered something about that Howard guy before catching himself and changing the subject. I spent the rest of the day searching online for Howard's name, finding almost nothing except a brief mention in an old neighborhood newsletter welcoming him to the area 5 years ago. No social media, no employment history I could find. Nothing. That night I packed a bag and went to stay at a motel 20 miles away, paying cash, not telling anyone where I was going. I needed one night of actual sleep, one night of peace to figure out my next move. But when I opened my duffel bag in the motel room, there was a folded piece of paper tucked between my clothes that hadn't been there when I packed. Same neat handwriting. Room 237 has bed bugs. Try room 144 instead. Sleep well, neighbor. I drove home immediately, my mind racing with questions about how he'd gotten into my house again, when he'd had time to plant that note. It was past midnight when I pulled into my driveway, and every light in Howard's house was off except for one, a dim glow from what I assumed was his basement window. I sat in my car for a moment, exhausted and scared, when I noticed something that made me sick to my stomach. My house key, the new one I'd just gotten that afternoon, was sitting on my dashboard. I was certain I'd put it in my pocket. I looked toward Howard's house and saw a silhouette in that basement window, just standing there, watching. I grabbed the key, ran to my door, and found it already unlocked. Inside, nothing seemed moved or disturbed, except for one thing. That teddy bear on my dresser was now facing the bed, exactly as Howard had suggested. I packed everything I could fit in my car that night, called my brother to tell him I was coming to stay with him indefinitely, and left. As I drove away, I saw Howard in my rearview mirror, standing in his driveway, holding something up in his hand. It looked like another key catching the streetlight as he slowly waved goodbye. I remember pulling into that driveway for the very first time with a strange mix of relief and excitement. The house wasn't anything luxurious, just a modest single-level place sitting at the edge of a quiet road where the town gave way to stretches of farmland and patches of forest. After years of cramped apartments and noise from traffic outside our windows, my partner and I thought we'd finally found our version of peace. The wide sky, the sound of crickets at night, and the distant smell of hay all gave us this comforting illusion that life here would be calm, predictable, and safe. At first, the setting delivered exactly what we wanted. We unpacked slowly, spending evenings on the porch, sipping cheap wine and watching the sunset melt into the fields. The quiet was almost overwhelming, but in a good way. It felt like stepping into a forgotten rhythm of life. Even our dog Murphy seemed happier, sniffing the grass and running free in the yard. I convinced myself this move would finally ground us, that we'd built a safe bubble far from the constant noise and stress we'd been used to. But then, we started noticing things. It began with the neighbors across the field dragging rusted car frames into their yard. I told myself it was harmless. Maybe they were hobby mechanics. But soon the sound of engines roaring and metal clanging filled every morning and bled into the evenings. There was no pattern, no schedule. Sometimes at dawn, sometimes late at night, like they worked whenever they felt like it. The sound carried across the open land, echoing in a way that made it impossible to ignore, no matter how many windows we closed. The smell came next. Every weekend without fail, they'd light massive piles of trash behind their property, and the smoke always drifted our way. It wasn't just leaves or wood, plastic, rubber, who knows what else. The fumes seeped into our curtains, clung to our clothes, even settled into the food if we dared open a window. I remember standing in the kitchen one Saturday watching gray smoke curl through the light like it was alive, moving slow and deliberate until the entire room reeked of chemicals. That's when I started to realize this wasn't just going to be a minor inconvenience. This place we thought was peaceful was slowly turning hostile. It didn't stop with smoke and noise. Behind their property line stretched a patch of woods, and some nights we'd hear sudden bursts of gunfire. At first, I thought it was just hunters, but it wasn't hunting season. The shots came at strange hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, sharp cracks that rattled the windows. Murphy would bark and pace around, ears pinned back, and I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each echo, wondering what kind of neighbors thought it was normal to fire rifles in the dark with houses nearby. The longer we stayed, the more it felt like the neighborhood belonged to them and we were just intruders. Every time I stepped outside, they'd stop whatever they were doing and watch. Not a casual glance, but a fixed, lingering stare that followed me until I went back inside. It got to the point where I avoided the yard altogether, even though the whole reason we moved there was to finally have open space. My partner tried to brush it off. They're just eccentric, maybe they don't realize how much it bothers us. But I could see the unease in their face too, especially after the third or fourth fire burned late into the night, throwing orange light over the trees like a warning. One evening, I decided to confront them. I walked across the lot while they were tinkering with a rusted truck frame. The man, tall with a gray beard that looked more like steel wool, leaned on a wrench while the woman, short and wiry, smoked a cigarette that smelled harsher than anything I'd ever inhaled. I tried to keep my tone calm, asking if they could maybe keep the fires smaller, since the smoke always drifted inside our home. They just stared. The man spat on the ground. The woman let out a low laugh, and without saying a single word, they turned back to their work. The rejection felt deliberate, like they wanted me to understand we had no say here. After that, things escalated in subtle but unnerving ways. Our mailbox would get left open, rain soaking through the letters. Deep ruts appeared in the dirt path leading up to our driveway, as if someone had spun their tires on purpose. Once, when I came home late, I noticed a row of glass bottles lined neatly along the edge of our fence, catching the moonlight. By the next morning, they were gone. It was small stuff, never enough to prove anything, never enough to call the police, but each incident chipped away at whatever sense of safety we thought this place would give us. The breaking point came on a Sunday evening. We were inside eating dinner when the familiar haze of smoke began to seep through the kitchen window. I stepped outside to check, and this time the fire wasn't just trash. It looked like an entire heap of furniture, plastic chairs, and even tires. The flames climbed so high they lit up the treetops, and sparks drifted dangerously close to our yard. My partner grabbed Murphy and stayed by the door while I dialed the fire department, my voice shaking as I tried to explain. By the time the truck arrived, the neighbors had already doused the flames with a garden hose, standing there smugly as if nothing was wrong. After that call, the atmosphere between us and them hardened. They didn't speak to us, but their glares said enough. One night I heard the rumble of an engine outside, and when I peeked through the blinds, their truck idled at the edge of our driveway for a solid minute before pulling away. No words, no gestures, just the hum of the engine in the dark. It was intimidation, plain and simple. I realized then that this wasn't going to change, no matter how many calls I made or conversations I tried to have. We lasted 3 more months before packing up and leaving. Every night felt heavier than the last. Every sound outside a reminder that we weren't wanted there. The house itself had been perfect for us, but the land surrounding it felt poisoned by hostility. We sold it for less than we paid, just to get out quickly. Driving away for the last time, I didn't feel relief, just a strange emptiness, like I was abandoning the version of peace I thought we'd finally found. Even now, when I catch the smell of burning plastic or hear a car engine rev in the distance, my mind shoots back to that place. It's been years, but I still wonder if those neighbors drove out anyone who dared move in after us. That house taught me something I never forgot. Peace isn't about where you live, it's about who surrounds you. And sometimes the worst nightmares aren't inside the house. They're right next door, watching, waiting, making sure you never forget them. That day sticks in my mind because it started with something so ordinary. I'd just gotten home from a long shift, carrying groceries up the narrow steps to my apartment. My new neighbor, a guy named Marcus, leaned against his truck and waved me over. He looked approachable enough. Broad smile, sunburn on his nose, holding a couple of beers already sweating in his hand. He offered me one before I'd even set my bags down. Felt like the beginning of the kind of easy neighborly relationship you don't see much anymore. For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. We'd chat outside in the evenings, him perched on the hood of his truck, me leaning against the railing with a cold drink. He told me he'd moved from a smaller town, said he was glad to finally have normal neighbors after dealing with idiots at his last place. I didn't think much of it. Everyone complains about neighbors at some point. I figured he just wanted a fresh start, and honestly, I was glad to have someone friendly next door. The first sign things weren't as smooth as I thought came after a minor disagreement. He'd asked if I could help him move a heavy piece of furniture late at night, and I told him I had work early the next morning. He gave me this blank stare, didn't argue, just walked back inside without another word. The next day, his attitude toward me felt different. He barely acknowledged me, just a nod that seemed forced. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I'd caught him in a bad mood. Then little things started piling up. His truck was suddenly parked so close to my car that I had to squeeze in through the passenger side just to get behind the wheel. Music blasted from his place at strange hours. Not every night, but enough to keep me on edge, like he wanted me to never feel completely comfortable at home. First, I wondered if I was overthinking it, but the pattern kept repeating, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. One night I came home around midnight and caught him standing right next to my car, staring at it like he was inspecting every inch. When he saw me, he didn't move right away. He just smirked and muttered something about people around here not respecting property. I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and walked back inside. The next morning, I noticed fresh scratches along the side of my car door. They weren't deep, but enough to be obvious. I couldn't prove it was him, yet it felt deliberate. Things escalated quickly after that. He started accusing me of petty things, leaving trash by his steps, letting packages sit too long in the hallway, even saying I borrowed tools from him and never returned them. None of it was true. Every time he confronted me, his voice carried this sharp edge, like he was daring me to argue. I tried to keep calm, telling him he must be mistaken, but he'd just shake his head like I was lying straight to his face. The shift from friendly neighbor to hostile stranger was so sudden it felt surreal. One afternoon, I pulled into the lot and found his truck parked practically against my bumper. I couldn't even back out without knocking into it. I knocked on his door to ask him to move it, and he opened it shirtless, blasting music so loud the walls vibrated. He leaned against the frame like he had all the time in the world, grinning at me while I struggled to raise my voice over the noise. "Guess you'll have to figure it out," he said before closing the door in my face. I ended up waiting almost an hour before he finally moved his truck. The worst moments were the confrontations outside. Twice he followed me as I walked toward my building, hurling accusations about things I hadn't done, his tone louder each time. The last time, he got close enough that I could smell beer on his breath, and for a second, I thought he might actually swing at me. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears, but I kept walking, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed to want. Still, the sense that he was pushing toward something dangerous never left me. After weeks of this tension, I started changing my routine just to avoid him. I'd leave earlier for work, come home later, sometimes circle the block until I was sure he wasn't outside. But one night, when I parked, he was already waiting. He leaned against his truck, arms crossed, the headlights casting his shadow long across the pavement. He said I'd been messing with his life, and that he knew what I was up to. His words didn't even make sense, but the way he said them, low and deliberate, made me feel like I was trapped in some feud I never agreed to. That was the moment I realized it wasn't going to stop on its own. The next morning, I spoke with the building manager, explaining everything. To my surprise, they admitted they'd had other complaints about him. Noise, intimidation, even threats. They told me to keep documenting incidents and promised to look into it. It wasn't exactly comforting, but it gave me a sliver of relief knowing I wasn't imagining how bad he'd gotten. A few days later, he was gone. His truck disappeared overnight, the blinds in his windows drawn tight. The manager said he'd broken his lease early. No explanation. I half expected him to come back for one last round, but he never did. Just like that, the constant pressure lifted. The silence in the parking lot, once unsettling, felt like the best sound in the world. I could finally breathe again. Even now, I don't fully understand what triggered his shift from friendly to hostile. Part of me wonders if he was looking for a fight all along, waiting for an excuse. Another part thinks he carried baggage from wherever he lived before, and I just became the target. Either way, I'll never forget how quickly someone can change, and how dangerous it feels when your own home stops being a place of peace. My name is Aaron, and during that time I was living alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the edge of a mid-sized town. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was mine, and after a rough breakup, I wanted the space to start over. My routine was simple: work at a dental office during the day, grab groceries on my way home, and spend most evenings quietly reading or watching TV. The building had a shared parking lot tucked behind it, with a single flickering light pole that only half lit the rows of cars. That lot, as ordinary as it seemed at first, became the reason I barely slept for months. It started subtly, just noise that carried through my thin walls after dark. I'd hear bursts of laughter, the crack of beer cans opening, and the heavy bass of someone's music rattling from a car with its doors open. At first, I brushed it off as neighbors blowing off steam. Everyone has the right to unwind, and it wasn't my place to complain. But after a week or so, I noticed a pattern. It wasn't different groups, it was always the same cluster of men, and they always seemed to gather right near my car. I couldn't help checking through my blinds whenever their voices rose. 5, maybe 6 of them leaning against hoods, passing bottles, tossing cigarette butts onto the pavement. They weren't particularly young, late 20s to mid-30s, rough around the edges with worn hoodies, scuffed boots, and the kind of casual arrogance that comes from knowing no one's going to stop you. The detail that bothered me most was how often their attention landed on my silver Corolla. It wasn't anything special, but more than once I caught them leaning on it like it was theirs, boots scraping the paint, one of them even spitting on the ground inches from the tires. The first time they noticed me watching, it was like a switch flipped. I'd only pulled the blinds back an inch, but one of them, tall, shaved head, a tattoo curling down his neck, tilted his chin up and smirked directly at my window. He said something I couldn't make out, but it made the others laugh in unison, their voices carrying too clearly through the still night. After that, the mockery became part of their routine. Every time I peeked out, they'd exaggerate gestures, point at my window, or shout things just loud enough for me to catch my name or the word princess. It was no longer just noise, it was aimed, and it was aimed at me. I started parking in different spots, hoping they wouldn't notice, but no matter where I left my car, they gravitated toward it. Sometimes they leaned their weight against the doors, leaving faint smudges on the windows, or tapped beer bottles on the trunk like it was their personal table. The thought of confronting them crossed my mind more than once, but I knew it wouldn't go anywhere. I was one woman against a group of men who thrived on being intimidating. Instead, I pretended I didn't notice, though inside it ate at me every night. The nights got louder and the jokes got sharper. One evening, while I was brushing my teeth, I heard my own last name shouted across the lot, like it was the punchline of some cruel joke. They shouldn't have known it, and the fact they did made me grip the sink so tight my knuckles went white. My mail had my name on it, sure, but it was in a locked box. That meant they'd either seen me bringing something inside or gone out of their way to find it. Either possibility was enough to make my chest tighten. From then on, I lived in a state of constant alert. I kept the TV on low at night, just so I could track when their laughter drifted closer. My blinds stayed closed, though sometimes I pressed my ear against the cool glass, straining to hear what they were saying. The sound of their boots crunching gravel, bottles clinking, and someone kicking at a bumper became the background noise of my evenings. I hated how small it made me feel, pacing around my own apartment while strangers claimed the space outside like it belonged to them. One night, I heard a different sound, a deliberate, slow drag across my car's hood. Metal on metal, sharp and high. My heart thudded as I realized they were scraping something against the paint. I didn't dare look, but the next morning the proof was there. A jagged line running across the front, deep enough that no amount of washing would hide it. I stood in the lot with my keys in hand, staring at the scar on my car, while one of the men lounged on a nearby bumper, watching me with a lazy, knowing expression. He didn't say a word, and that silence was worse than anything he could have shouted. I started dreading the walk from my apartment door to the car. Even in daylight, I felt their eyes on me. One of them would always nudge another when I passed, muttering under his breath with a grin that made my pulse race. I called the landlord, but his response was a flat, "Not much I can do, it's a shared lot." That sentence alone left me feeling abandoned, like I had no backup in a place that was supposed to be my home. I considered breaking the lease, but moving costs weren't an option for me then. The turning point came late on a Friday night. Their voices were louder than usual, echoing up the stairwell into my living room. Then came 3 sharp bangs, not on a car, but on my own front door. My breath caught in my throat as the knocks repeated. Slower this time, deliberate. The laughter outside roared. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood in the dark with my back pressed against the wall, counting the seconds until the noise drifted away again. When I finally dared to peek through the peephole, no one was there, just the dim glow from the parking lot. That night I made my decision. The next morning I called my brother, explained everything, and he drove over with 2 friends. We spent the entire day hauling boxes into a rented truck. I didn't even finish cleaning out the place. I just wanted out. The men were out there while we packed, lounging against a pickup, watching with lazy smirks. They didn't interfere, but their presence made my skin crawl. My brother caught one of their stares and muttered, "Don't worry, they won't try anything with us here." I clung to that reassurance even though I wasn't convinced. I moved into a smaller unit across town, closer to my job and in a complex with security cameras and brighter lights. It's been years, and I still avoid driving past that old street. The memory sticks with me, though. Not just the harassment, but how quickly a simple living situation can turn into something unsafe. People always say, "Trust your gut," and I wish I had listened sooner. The scratches on my old car eventually faded under new paint, but the sense of being cornered in my own space hasn't left me. To this day, I still catch myself checking the blinds twice before I sleep.